On the 27th of December, 2021, passengers moved through Geneva Airport as normal when armed officers approached a British traveller preparing to leave Switzerland. Within moments, he was detained under an international arrest request linked to one of the largest EncroChat investigations carried out by the Metropolitan Police. James Harding had spent months living luxuriously in the United Arab Emirates while directing a cocaine importation network operating across the United Kingdom. Investigators already believed the organization had moved around a ton of cocaine into the country in just weeks, generating millions in profit. What brought the operation to an end was not a seized shipment or an informant, it was thousands of encrypted messages recovered by police, messages that laid out drug deals, payments, logistics, and plans to arrange the killing of a rival. Those messages also led directly to Jayes Kharouti, identified as Harding's trusted partner inside the UK, coordinating deliveries and managing distribution while the network expanded rapidly. By the time Harding was taken into custody at the airport, detectives had already mapped the structure of the organization, identified its members, and uncovered a murder conspiracy before it could be carried out. The arrests marked the collapse of a criminal enterprise that had operated at the highest level of the drug trade while its leaders believed their communications were secure. This is the story of how James Harding and Jayes Kharouti built that operation, how encrypted phones exposed every part of it, and how a lifestyle funded by drug money ended in life sentences at the Old Bailey. If you follow real crime stories that show how power and control can disappear in a single moment, consider subscribing, because this case begins exactly where their freedom ended. By 2019, the UK cocaine market was operating at a scale rarely seen before. Demand had expanded far beyond traditional city centres. Cocaine was no longer confined to nightclubs or specific social groups. It had become embedded across different income levels, spreading through London, commuter towns, and into regional cities across the southeast. Supply chains adapted to match the demand, becoming faster, more organized, and increasingly international. Large quantities of cocaine were moving into the UK through established European entry points before being transferred inland through lead distribution networks. Importation and wholesale supply were no longer handled by small groups working independently. Operations were structured, with defined roles: importers, transport coordinators, warehouse handlers, and regional distributors. Communication between these layers needed to be fast and secure, and that requirement led many organized crime groups toward encrypted technology. EncroChat became central to that shift. The devices were modified mobile phones stripped of normal functions. They could not make standard calls or access common apps. Instead, they were built around encrypted messaging systems marketed as secure from law enforcement surveillance. Users paid substantial subscription fees for access, and within organized crime circles, EncroChat developed a reputation as a safe environment to discuss shipments, payments, and enforcement without fear of interception. Across Europe, thousands of organized criminals adopted the platform. In the UK, it quickly became embedded within drug supply networks moving cocaine at wholesale scale. What users did not know was that European law enforcement agencies had already begun infiltrating the system. Investigators gained access to messages before they were encrypted, allowing them to observe criminal activity in real time. Conversations that users believed were private were being collected, translated, and analyzed. Names were rarely used, but patterns, language, and operational details began to expose entire networks. This environment formed the backdrop to Harding and Kharouti's operation. The network they were involved in was not street-level dealing. It operated at the importation and wholesale stage, moving large quantities of cocaine into the UK before distributing it through secondary suppliers across London and surrounding regions. The scale meant that profits accumulated quickly. Investigators later estimated that around £5 million was generated within just 10 weeks of activity. James Harding positioned himself away from the physical risks of the operation. Based in Dubai, he operated remotely, using encrypted communication to coordinate supply, payments, and logistics. Distance provided both status and perceived protection. From overseas, he could oversee movements without direct contact with drugs or couriers. Jayes Kharouti remained closer to the ground. Based in Surrey, he was positioned within reach of the distribution network itself. His role connected importation to local movement, ensuring that shipments were received, stored, and passed into the next layer of supply. London served as the central hub, with drugs moving outward through established routes into other parts of the country. From the outside, nothing about the system appeared unusual. Vehicles moved normally. Properties used for storage blended into residential areas. Communication happened through devices designed to leave no trace. But by early 2020, the same technology that allowed the network to grow was quietly documenting every decision being made. James Harding was originally from Hampshire. In public, he presented himself as a businessman dealing in high-value luxury watches, a trade that allowed large sums of money to move without attracting attention. By the time the operation later examined in court was active, Harding was living in Dubai, surrounded by wealth, expensive vehicles, and regular international travel. Distance from the United Kingdom allowed him to operate without direct contact with drugs or transport routes while still maintaining authority over decisions being made inside the network. Evidence presented during proceedings described Harding as occupying a leadership position. Instructions moved through him. Quantities, pricing, and movement of supply were discussed through encrypted communication rather than face-to-face meetings. Operating abroad reinforced a sense of separation from the risks faced by those working closer to the ground. Jayes Kharouti operated differently. Older and based in Surrey, he functioned as the organizer within the UK side of the supply chain. His role focused on coordination, ensuring that deliveries were received, stored, and passed onward through distribution channels. He acted as the link between planning and execution, managing logistics and maintaining contact with those responsible for movement inside the country. The relationship between Harding and Kharouti developed into a clear hierarchy. Communication between them was constant, conducted through EncroChat aliases rather than personal phones. Decisions were made quickly, with both men relying on encrypted messaging as the central tool for running the operation. As profits increased, roles became more defined, and dependence on each other's position within the network grew. Money and status reinforced confidence. Successful shipments increased the scale of activity, and encrypted communication created a belief that discussions could take place without consequence. That confidence shaped how decisions were made, allowing risk to become part of normal business. If you value real crime stories told through evidence and careful detail, take a moment to like the video. It helps these stories reach more people who want the full picture behind cases like this. The operation centered on importing cocaine from mainland Europe into the United Kingdom and supplying it at wholesale level. Shipments arrived in significant quantities over a short period, moving quickly through established routes before being passed to regional distributors. The model relied on speed and volume. Once drugs entered the country, they were moved on without delay, reducing the risk of loss and keeping supply consistent. EncroChat messages later recovered by investigators showed how the network functioned day to day. Quantities were discussed openly. Payments were confirmed through messages and photographs. Deliveries were acknowledged once completed. Conversations reflected a structured operation rather than isolated deals, with each stage dependent on timing and coordination. Investigators later estimated that close to a ton of cocaine had been imported within months. The scale meant high turnover and rapid profit. Large sums circulated through the network, reinforcing the belief that the system was working without interruption. Harding remained abroad, issuing instructions and approving decisions remotely, while activity in the UK continued through trusted contacts managing movement and storage. The financial rewards were visible. Travel, high-value purchases, and a lifestyle built around luxury formed the public image. The source of that income remained hidden behind legitimate fronts and distance from direct handling of drugs. As activity increased, conversations began to shift. Messages showed concern about rival figures and the risk of robbery during transport. Discussions moved beyond supply and into removing perceived threats. At one stage, an offer was discussed to pay for the killing of a courier believed to be causing problems for the organization. At that point, the operation crossed from large-scale drug trafficking into planned violence. Confidence had grown with each successful shipment, and without immediate consequences, risk became normalized. Decisions that once carried serious hesitation were now treated as part of protecting business interests. In early 2020, European law enforcement agencies gained access to the EncroChat network. Messages were captured before encryption took effect, allowing investigators to read communications as they were being sent. Thousands of conversations linked to UK-based users were passed to specialist teams for analysis. Detectives began identifying patterns. Recurring usernames, repeated references to quantities, prices, and delivery schedules. As messages were examined over time, investigators understood the scale of the operation. The volume of cocaine being discussed pointed to importation at wholesale level, not street supply. At the same time, conversations revealed discussions about arranging violence against a rival courier, raising immediate concerns about a planned murder. the response was controlled. Officers continued monitoring communications rather than making immediate arrests. The priority was to understand the structure of the network, identify everyone involved, and prevent harm while gathering evidence strong enough to support prosecution. Steps were taken to protect the intended target while surveillance continued. Gradually, investigators built a timeline showing how shipments entered the country, how payments moved, and who held authority within the organization. EncroChat usernames were compared against travel records, financial activity, and images shared through the platform. Photographs of watches, vehicles, and locations helped narrow identities further. One account in particular, operating under the name The Topsking, became central to the investigation. Messages connected the user to decision-making at the highest level of the network. Travel data, financial links, and communication patterns ultimately tied the account to Jayes Harding. Similar work connected Jayes Kharouti to coordination inside the UK. By this stage, detectives had assembled evidence covering drug importation, supply, and conspiracy to murder. The investigation had moved from intelligence gathering to preparing charges capable of standing in court. By late 2021, the investigation had reached the stage where arrests could begin. Evidence gathered from EncroChat messages, supported by travel records and financial analysis, allowed officers to move against those identified as leading figures within the network. Jayes Harding was detained at Geneva Airport on the 27th of December 2021 while traveling through Switzerland. The arrest followed an international request linked to the Metropolitan Police investigation. After legal proceedings overseas, he was extradited to the United Kingdom to face charges connected to large-scale drug importation and conspiracy to murder. Jayes Kharouti was also located abroad and returned to the UK as part of the same investigation. His arrest removed the individual responsible for coordinating activity within the country, effectively ending the operational side of the network. At the same time, other members connected to the supply chain were arrested in coordinated action. Properties were searched, devices seized, and communication between associates stopped immediately. The structure that had relied on encrypted messaging and remote direction no longer functioned once its senior figures were in custody. News coverage followed quickly, identifying the case as part of the wider EncroChat investigations that had exposed organized crime groups across the UK and Europe. Within criminal circles, the arrest signaled that encrypted communication was no longer providing the protection many had assumed. The evidence gathered during the investigation confirmed that discussions about arranging a killing had progressed far enough to form the basis of conspiracy charges. The planned attack never took place. Intervention came before any violence could be carried out. What ended the operation was not a single mistake or failed shipment. It was the accumulation of messages, conversations sent with confidence, later forming the record that led directly to arrest and prosecution. The case proceeded to trial at the Old Bailey, where proceedings lasted several weeks. Prosecutors set out the structure of the organization and placed Jayes Harding at its center, describing him as the figure directing large-scale cocaine importation while operating from abroad. The case relied heavily on EncroChat evidence, with messages presented to the jury showing discussions about drug quantities, payments, delivery arrangements, and plans connected to violence. The prosecution argued that the messages demonstrated authority, decision-making, and control, linking Harding directly to the highest level of the network. Jayes Kharouti was presented as the organizer within the UK, responsible for coordination and ensuring that supply moved through distribution channels once shipments arrived. The defense challenged identification, arguing that encrypted usernames could not conclusively prove who was behind the devices. The reliability and interpretation of EncroChat material formed a central part of the arguments presented in court. After considering the evidence, the jury returned guilty verdicts. Harding and Kharouti were convicted of conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and conspiracy to murder. During sentencing, the court described the scale of cocaine importation as difficult to comprehend, reflecting the quantities discussed within the recovered communications. Jayes Harding received a life sentence with a minimum term of 32 years. Jayes Kharouti was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years. Cases like this often divide opinion. Some see long sentences as justice, others see them as inevitable consequences. If you have a view on this outcome, share it below. The convictions of Jayes Harding and Jayes Kharouti form part of a wider shift in organized crime investigations across the UK. The EncroChat operation provided law enforcement with direct access to conversations that revealed how modern drug networks were structured, how decisions were made, and how supply moved across borders. It became one of the most significant intelligence breakthroughs used against organized crime in recent years. The removal of senior suppliers disrupted existing distribution chains. Networks built around trust and encrypted communication were forced to reorganize, while ongoing investigations continued to identify others linked to similar activity. The case demonstrated that encrypted platforms, once treated as secure operating environments, could also become detailed records of criminal activity when accessed by investigators. It also exposed the contrast between appearance and reality. Wealth accumulated quickly through large-scale supply, but the same speed applied to its collapse once evidence was gathered. The lifestyle associated with success in organized crime proved temporary when examined through the legal process. This case was not only about drugs. It was about control, reputation, and the belief that technology could replace caution. If you want more real stories told without exaggeration, cases built from evidence, not rumors, subscribe and stay with us for the next investigation.